Hello and welcome to the Booktopia podcast. I'm Ben Hunter, Booktopia's fiction category manager. This is a podcast about books and the brilliant people who read them and write them. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague Shanu Prasad. Hi Shanu.
Hello Ben.
And it's our pleasure to have with us John Byron. John Byron is a writer who grew up in Sydney, now lives in Melbourne. The Tribute is his first novel. It was shortlisted for the prestigious Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Unpublished Manuscript in 2019. It was then picked up by Firm Press, who are the publishers of successes like Christian White, Pip Williams, and my goodness, The Tribute is a dark and creepy novel. John, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here creeping you out.
Where do we begin? Should you take us all the way back to your failed medical school years and tell us about this anatomy textbook that kind of sparked a fire for you?
I can. My failed medical still appears in my transcript when I've got a PhD from the same institution. There, above the PhD, is my failed medical school.
Well, you can't scrub that.
Can't scrub it. No, it's stuck with it. Anyway,
May as well turn it into something
that's
useful
right.
in a novel then.
This is my giving back to society of those years of publicly funded education. While I was there, I learnt about the foundation text of modern European anatomy, the Fabrica of Andreas Vesalius, a 16th century text. But where I really got interested in it as potential for fiction was I was working my way through my medical degree in a bar, like a lot of people do, and one of my colleagues was this really talented artist who had kind of missed his calling there and ended up in bar work for some reason, but he was obsessed with Vesalius and obsessed with this text. And that obsession is what kind of lodged itself in my mind for when I came back to writing fiction. And he was very good. He would be ranting about these anatomical drawings and then drawing them freehand from memory on the spot in these incredibly, like almost photorealistic renderings. It's amazing. And so while I am sure that fellow hasn't broken any laws ever of any kind, he probably hasn't even crossed the street against the lights, the pitch of the obsession stuck with me. I thought people really are into this stuff, and there are train spotters of anatomy texts, and so that's how this character came to be.
I think we're all guilty of imagining a colleague as a potential serial killer at one stage or another, and I'm glad you've mined that for something glorious.
Yeah. And so when I left med school and for the greater good and went into something where I'd be less dangerous, the humanities, and did a couple of English degrees, that also starts to, again, you pick up what the stuff that you do. So I was working my way through my arts degree on a bank IT help desk, and some of that insight into how much information about us all is swirling around out there has found its way into this as well. So, you sort of do pick and choose things from your experience. So.
Absolutely. And you've had such an interesting and varied career. I mean, in your bio, it sort of goes through all of the, a number of different jobs that you've had.
It's only a small selection.
Small selection. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So what you're saying is there's many opportunities for many books to come.
Maybe.
To mine other parts of your life that you haven't quite explored yet in this first book.
Career has two real meanings in English, and one of them is the kind of really fake one about planning a very linear and logical and rational work life for yourself, and the other is what an out-of-control car does down a suburban street. And so I've had that latter one as my work history.
As your work history.
Yeah.
Can you take me through the full academic gambit? I'm just getting the very smart guy vibes from you. So you said medicine, then a couple of English degrees. To use your words.
Yeah. So I did a BA in mostly a double major actually in English at Adelaide Uni, and did some philosophy and political science and astronomy actually as part of that, which was fun on the way through. Did honours there, and then I did a PhD in English at Sydney Uni, and I wrote on film and philosophy, so it's movies that problematise the nature of reality or even the nature of one's own identity, so Blade Runner and The Matrix and stuff like that.
Yep. Terminator. Did you have to watch Terminator 2? I watched Terminator 2 for my film studies.
I did. I didn't write on Terminator 2. It probably features on the way through. I made mention of lots of movies, but there were sort of four main ones.
Okay, so how did you get from watching The Matrix and Terminator 2 to then working in Canberra?
So part of what I did while I was a postgrad student at Sydney Uni is I got roped into being on the Sydney University Postgraduate Representative Association Council. And so I got involved in that, and I discovered that I discovered I had an interest in research policy, and just as a kind of amateur political, I guess a student advocate.
Yep.
And I got involved in that, and I got myself elected to be the national president of the Council of Australian Postgraduate Associations in 2001, which was a little bit of a detour. And my supervisor in the English department at Sydney Uni retired during that year and didn't bother organising a new supervisor, because he made the assumption, not unreasonable actually, that I probably wasn't coming back, because mostly when people go off to do that sort of stuff, they don't come back.
Yeah.
But I did go back because I had a really great topic and I loved it, and I had got a really good supervisor, Dave Kelly, and went through, and that was all a good experience. But that's how I ended up in that realm. And during that year, there was the Senate did an inquiry into higher education, and I gave evidence to that, and you sort of get in front of people who take notice of you and think, oh, this guy's all right. And then eventually I went to work at the Australian Academy of the Humanities. I was the executive director there for almost 7 years, and then I went finally across to the dark side, as they call it, and worked for Senator Kim Carr, who was then the Minister for Innovation, Industry, Science and Research.
Did that time in Canberra, those winters in Canberra, give you the visions of dismembering bodies that ended up in this novel? Or
no, not exactly. It did mean I had to sell my Ducati. I had a beautiful Ducati Monster 900 that was a gorgeous motorcycle, but it's just too cold in Canberra to ride a motorbike. So I had to buy a windscreen, and they come with a free car. So that was the end of that. But no, I think that the political side of it, there are a few politicians that appear in here, so I guess I wrote those scenes with greater confidence than I might have otherwise. They're not really based on anybody, but and they're not central to the story. But you never know, a future one may well plumb those depths.
Absolutely. Sorry, you'll have to excuse my voice today. So why then? This is the question. I mean, we're very glad you did, but why did you then decide to write a crime novel as opposed to, say, a political thriller or a book about film or any of those other things?
Yeah.
What was it that drew you to crime for your first novel?
I've always read a lot of crime. I mean, I read pretty widely though. I'm interested in most genres, and I'm a voracious reader. I read fiction every day. Otherwise something goes bad in my head. And so I guess that's, it felt like a reasonably comfortable home for me. Mm-hmm. I felt like I understood the genre and what people are reading and what the tropes are and so on. But the other thing I really like about crime is that it seems like a genre so science fiction's great strength is it's really good at asking those big what-if questions, which is why 3 of the 4 films that I wrote for my PhD happened to be in science. I wasn't really interested in the science fiction side of it per se, but those contexts are really great for asking those really fundamental, undermining kind of questions.
What is humanity? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, all of that, yeah. And so that lent itself. But the other thing, so in crime though, it's really good at putting ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances and under a lot of pressure and seeing what happens. And I think it's sort of a little bit like what Philip K. Dick said about the Ridley Scott's rendering of his story into Blade Runner. It's kind of like everything he did in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, only more so. It sort of takes the essence of it, takes the active ingredient, extracts it out. And I think crime is very good for doing that. It really is a nice way to test how things work. In ordinary life, in sort of social realist sort of fiction, under less stressful circumstances, you might not come to a pressure point where people have to start to react. And crime puts people into that sort of position.
Yeah. And can you let us know a little bit about the process of what it was like writing this book? I think we were just briefly mentioning before, trying to work out the timeline of how you were doing these, quite high pressure jobs, and then somehow you've managed to write a manuscript. So can you just tell us about how that sort of came together? Yeah,
well, that was self-funded fellowship, basically. Save money, stop working for a while, and then write until you could see the money was going to run out and get another job. Is actually, in reality, that's what happens, because those political jobs, they're great, they're very rewarding, they're really high pressure, and there's just not spare headspace. There's not a lot of spare time either, but it's as much about headspace as anything. But this story had been rattling around in my head for a really long time and had developed over many years. And so the climactic scene, which we've agreed we're not going to discuss today.
No, but it's excellent. Excellent, listeners. Very, very good.
The essence of it, the structure of it, was in a short story that I wrote unsuccessfully for a competition in 1990.
Wow.
Really long time ago, like I was a kid. And so that, I'm not saying that was the genesis of this whole book, but, Vesalius came later, for instance. But, bits of it had been around for a really long time. So by the time I sat down to write this, I had a pretty clear idea about the basic plot and the characters and who was going to do what to whom. And so it made, I didn't really have any kind of, I didn't have to sit there and go, well, what's my first, I just picked a scene to write with. I know which one it was, but I just sat down one day at Grub Cafe in Fitzroy and just started writing, because I just sort of, that's the one, I had a scene in my mind, let's just start writing it. And the whole thing flowed from there. And this is a very different book than that first draft, of course, as you would hope. But, it actually already had on tap an awful lot of ideas already about how it was all going to come together, because I'd just been sort of dwelling on it for many years. I just didn't have the time to sit down and write. It didn't stop me from thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can really tell that in this book, that it feels like a fully realised world.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like, it feels like you could just,
great.
As much as it is like a serial killer story,
Yeah.
it feels like you could just walk and you'd be like, yep, I recognise that street, and
Yeah.
I've gone past that bar.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Which is really wonderful. And what was the process like of getting picked up by a firm press who obviously recognised this from being in the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards 2019 shortlist?
Yeah.
But what was that? How was that process? So you submit. I don't know how these things work. So you've written this manuscript, and then you go, what am I going to do with it? And you decided to submit it to the Victoria's Premier's Prize, or they.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, so I had a tilt at that award, and that was a good tip from my friend Andrew Nettie, who was shortlisted himself a little while earlier, and he said, look, it just gives you good exposure. People pay attention to the shortlist, and
Yep.
they had hundreds of entries, and it's a shortlist of 3. And there's an element of luck in getting on that shortlist. I mean, it doesn't mean that the others weren't. There would have been plenty of really good shortlistable ones.
Like all awards.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I felt quite fortunate to have been plucked out of that. And but it did give a good bit of exposure. I also had already been looking for an agent, and I'd been in touch with Inkwell. So Catherine Drayton, my agent, was already interested in the book, but because of a tech fail at my end, my internet provider had rejected their reply. Yes, we'd love to read your manuscript. Send more of your manuscript. I'd sent them 50 pages. Yeah, and so then I never got back to them from their point of view, and I didn't get that email. And so after
It's a Meg Ryan film waiting to happen.
Oh yeah. After I got shortlisted, I sent a repeat to a few, not very many, but a few people.
Just another cold email.
Yeah, saying
got a book.
You may be now
Did you
interested.
know?
Yeah, and they got back and said, well, we already answered you, yes. And here's the email to prove it. And they had the rejection thing.
Oh wow.
And it was just like, wow. And so anyway, luckily we had a second bite at that cherry, and which doesn't often happen. And so the one really, well, there are many good things about working with Inkwell, but one of them is that it's a New York-based agency, the Sydney office, and they have an editorial staff back at the mothership, and which is a great advantage, having people to do. So we did a full draft with some pretty expert editorial advice before we even went out to the marketplace. And so it was in good enough shape to get shortlisted, and then they polished it up from there, and then we went out. And so, Martin Hughes from a firm came back with such enthusiasm. He really understood what I was doing with this book. And it was a real pleasure to be picked up by them. And he made some very good editorial suggestions that we took on board, and so I'm really pleased with how they've done. And they've made it a beautiful thing.
The cover is very striking.
The cover's great, but also because the illustrations are integral.
Oh my goodness, yes, yes.
And that was part of my manuscript. They were always in there. And, we've got the permission from the Swiss publishers, Cargo, who were very generous in giving
That was
us...
my other question. I was going to say, was that hard? Because I'm not quite sure, because it's such an old text, but I presume there's still people that have got the rights to...
They don't have the rights to the original stuff.
No.
But what happened is Cargo made, on the 500th anniversary of the birth of Vesalius, I think, they had a project in train so that in that year they were able to publish what they call the new Fabrica. And it's a new English translation of the 1543 and 1555 editions that were published in Vesalius' lifetime. And it's sort of like a comparative text, and they did new renderings of all of the illustrations from scratch. So took probably high quality photographs and then rendered from there. And so we were really keen to use those beautiful, very crisp digital renderings rather than finding a version that was out of copyright. We could take a photograph
And
of
it's
it.
not excellent. Yeah.
And so they were very generous in giving permission for that, and then supplied those files. And
Well, I think there's going to be, for people that have never heard of the Fabrica, there's going to be a lot of renewed interest thanks to your book. In fact, I realise that we've had such a great time. We're talking all around the book, but we haven't even asked you to do...
We've done a good job of not spoiling.
Yeah,
that's true.
But we've got to the point where we haven't even really... Can you give us a little quick elevator pitch?
Yeah, okay.
We prefer the authors to do this for crime novels.
We've got that it's a serial killer.
Yeah, it's a serial killer.
And that it's based on...
this anatomy element.
Yeah.
So I think that's already whetted people's appetites. But you haven't even mentioned this character, Spud Murphy on the other side of that.
Yeah.
So we'll get to Spud
Or
Murphy.
his wife or his sister.
Yeah.
So it's like, and how they all interact.
And it's right. Explosively.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. So the serial killer is a guy, as you've probably all guessed, who's obsessed with this text. And so he has, and you put those two things together, he is conducting his crimes by way of dissections, and which is a very macabre form. So you can see influences of things like, Red Dragon, the predecessor to The Silence of the Lambs, and I guess The Name of the Rose and the film Seven. These kinds of quite dark, obsessive crimes that are they're sort of inward. They're crimes that they're not conducted for anybody else's benefit. They are someone who is so self-contained in their obsession that it's entirely a project for their own satisfaction. And that's kind of what I was aiming for with this character. So he's out there doing that, and he's being pursued by the New South Wales homicide detective David Spud Murphy.
Love that.
And I do have what I hope is a funny little vignette about how he acquired that name.
Yes.
But anyway, so he's leading the homicide squad into that, but the guy, which is not unusual for obsessives, prepares his crime scenes incredibly well and gives them nothing to work with, doesn't leave any DNA behind,
There's no apparent motives, right? So
no apparent
when
motives,
you start,
no connection
you don't know
between
why
the
this
victims
is
that they
happening.
can find, all of that sort of stuff. And so it's really proving pretty intractable. But because there's this anatomy angle, the medicos in a forensic types, pretty early on, I don't think this is a terrible spoiler, pretty early on suggest that he's working from some kind of textbook. And the detective's sister is an art historian at Sydney Uni, and she is a specialist in the history of the depiction of the body. And so she becomes involved, first place quite informally and then a little more formally, in helping the investigation in case she can spot something that they're not trained to see. And so that's how the sister gets involved, and it's Jo. And then along the way, we learn a little bit more about their little domestic life, because Jo lives not too far away from Murphy and his wife Sylvia, and Sylvia and Jo are best mates, and so things sort of go from there. So,
there's so many questions. I have so many questions, and I always find it very hard when we're talking about crime novels that I have read. Sometimes I think I should not read the books before we have these podcasts.
Or read the first half or something.
Yeah, that I can't accidentally spoil things. But can you tell us a little bit more about the characters themselves, about Spud and about Jo and about Sylvia, and just what was did you find one of them harder to write about, like harder to write from the perspective of? Because this is what we should explain, that it is written from multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
So, did you find some bits harder to... and from the serial killer's perspective, I should also add, sorry.
His was probably the hardest, the serial killer. Stephen Porter is his name.
That's probably a good sign for you.
Yeah.
I
I think that's the right answer, and you have passed, and you may continue.
So partly because I was quite content to leave him to be a little bit of a cipher. I didn't want to go too much into any
His
kind
traumatic childhood. And
all the bogus explanation of it. He just is,
Yep.
And so that doesn't give you as much traction when you're trying to portray. So I just when you're in his headspace, it's more the technicalities that are in front of him. He's solving problems, to make sure that he's safe to do his business. So that's, and then there's a little bit of him reacting to how it all proceeds, by the time he's in the media and everything. So I found that one the hardest one, actually, because I couldn't imagine myself into that headspace as a lived experience. And it's, as you say, that's good. I'm going to be able to leave here not in custody, so that's terrific. Murphy was problematic. He's a complicated guy. He's one of those salt of the earth, top bloke, hard drinking.
he's good at his job too, right?
Sporty. He's good at his job.
Really good.
He's decorated. He's a very good success rate. He's a pretty good boss, tough but fair kind of boss. He loses his top a couple of times, but gets over it quickly, all that kind of stuff. So we all know people like Murphy. I don't feel like I am anything like Murphy. It's probably not for me to judge, though. I'll let other people do that. But he does drink double ristrettos, so I share that with him. And his whiskey preferences are from single malts from Isla, but that's it,
Yep.
And so I found him a little bit harder as well. Joe and Sylvia, I did a really quite well-developed backstory for Sylvia that never made it into this. But nevertheless, I find that a really useful exercise, actually. Sort of 4,000 or 5,000 words of her backstory. And so I know a lot more about her than appears in this book, but I had a very clear sense of who she is. She had a pretty unpleasant upbringing in a country town in Western Australia, pulled herself out of that, got out of town, put herself through nursing school in Western Australia, and when she could, moved east to just get away from that bad scene and start life on her own terms. And so that was good for me to know about her. None of that is a spoiler because there's none of that's explicit in the book, but that gave me a really good sense of this is she's got good resources and has a good sense of herself. And then Jo, as an academic in the humanities, my background of, I know plenty of people, like she's kind of based on, there's an awful lot of women academics in the humanities in particular that I've known over the years that I've got an awful lot of respect for, who are really good humans and really have a good sense of how they fit in the world and how society and culture operate at a pretty nuanced level. And so so Jo is based on a bunch, in some ways, on a bunch of different women that I know and love and admire in my life, and I'm very fortunate to have people like both Jo and Sylvia there. So I found that even though they're getting into the headspace of writing from a woman's perspective, obviously there are things that one doesn't know as a bloke, and you've got to be a bit sort of humble about that and recognise that. But they are based on people that I have a lot of affection and respect for.
Yeah.
So that helped a lot.
Yeah, I think that really comes across because, I think Jo was probably my favourite character in the book. You really went on the journey with her and sort of her and her perspective.
She's my favourite too. So it's probably not surprising. Although Ruby Ashby-Orr, who's my copy editor, her favourite, she let slip to me right near the end, is Sylvia.
So there you go. See, I think that's wonderful, everyone. And then we will judge the people whose favourite person is the serial killer.
That's right.
One thing I found myself really enjoying is the depictions of Sydney. You do that really well.
Oh, great.
And you're a Melbourneian, but you explained to us that you grew up in Sydney's West.
I grew up in Sydney's West,
Which is like, for me, I feel like that's the heart of Sydney. That's where everything happens.
Yeah,
that's where I live now, so it absolutely is, because I'm there.
It's Parramatta boy. But the sort of ancestral family, we're St George Dragons people. Sorry, Dad, who went over to Parramatta, but that never stuck for me. But and we have sort of a couple of generations back, legends of renting in Coogee. If only we were still in Coogee. And said, yeah, but we were renters, so we wouldn't be still in Coogee. Love Coogee. A couple of my brothers have spent a bit of time living there, and in fact, Joe's apartment is one of my brother's old apartments.
I was going to say, because I could picture that apartment. When you were writing about the apartment, I could 100% see it.
Yeah, so it's a real place.
Yep. There we go.
So I've got a lot of effect. It's a beautiful, beautiful city, and it's very picturesque. And so having the opportunity to write, especially, to have things happen at different places around town, even though a lot of it does happen in that Coogee-Randwick area, there is crime scenes all over, and having that opportunity, especially anywhere near water, this city, on a clear day is just spectacular.
Yeah, and such a contrast, right? You've got this contrast of these bloody, and I mean that in the literal sense, murders, and the beautiful scenery and surroundings.
And part of it's the flora as well. That's a really important part of Sydney is trees and flowers, and that's a really big part of the changing seasons as well.
Do you reckon it was easier to write such a terrifying book with that distance?
No doubt, absolutely, yeah. Like imagine it in a place that was gloomy and a bit too gothic all the time.
But as someone who's not living there at the time,
I see. Yeah.
Put yourself away from the action.
Yeah, maybe. Actually, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that's probably true. That writing this when I'm physically somewhere else and living somewhere else, probably that's the case. But I was also inspired by Elizabeth Harrower, who provides the epigram to this novel, who wrote a number of Sydney-based novels where the city, the sort of physical environment is a really important part of her narrative all the way through, and that really, I just wanted to sort of pay homage, I guess, and maybe steal perhaps a little bit of that as well for myself. Is that it just sort of situated me in the scene of what's going on, so it makes it a lot easier to write if you can imagine yourself there.
Yep.
Very clever and very creepy. That's the vibe I'm getting from this. What do you want readers to take away from your novel?
Wow. Well, I want them to enjoy it, first of all, and I hope that the plotting, there's a certain kind of crime reader, and I'm one of them, who really get a lot out of following a fairly intricate and meticulously constructed plot. So I don't think there are any potholes in here. I guess I'm asking for it. If anybody finds one, better let me know. But I think I've got all that covered. I mean, I had a lot of time to think about it.
Yep.
So there's the satisfactions of a good yarn. And one of the things that did not happen to me studying English at university is I never stopped reading for just the pure bloody pleasure of it. And I love a good yarn, and I like interesting characters, and that's enough. But I do also have, I'm going to be careful here with the spoiler angle, but there is a social purpose as well. And I don't agree with Harold Bloom that you have to choose between literary quality and effect and having an effect in the world, what he calls politics, but it's much more than just politics. I don't think you actually have to choose between those two things. I think you can do both, and I'm hoping that's what I've done here. So I'd like people to have a sense of a satisfying yarn, that they also have some sense of what it is I'm trying to do and say as well about how we live today.
Wow.
Absolutely. That's an excellent way of saying that without ruining or spoiling anything in the book.
Good.
So well done.
Lucky.
Yeah.
You're going to do this again?
Am I going to do another one?
Yeah.
I'm actually working, funny you asked this a little earlier, I'm working on an idea for a political thriller set in the Second World War. Or starts in the Second World War.
That is different.
That is different, yeah. That I'm sort of working that up. But I could see a sequel to this, and I've got some ideas for that as well.
Okay, because that was I had a question that I running sort of short on time, so I didn't ask every single question I had, but that was one of my questions, was like, do we see more in this world?
I think we could do that. Part of it is because, partly out of interest of length, but also to have a nice clean finish, is that Martin gave me some very good advice saying you just lose the last 6,000 words. You don't need that. That hurt. Anyway, I did lop off that limb. But one of the things that got...
Lop off that limb.
Sorry. Oh, crikey. One of the things that happened was that it left a few more potential tiny but present loose ends. So, does it finish as cleanly? Actually, the attentive reader will say, okay, there might not be plot holes, but there are a few things there are threads you could pull here, and I reckon that could be a pretty nice basis for what comes next in this world.
We will wait in anticipation.
Indeed.
John Byron, thank you for being with us.
Thank you both for having me. It's been really great having a yarn.
The Tribute is published by Firm Press, and you can buy it right now from booktopia.com.au.
Thank you for listening to the Booktopia podcast channel. Don't forget, you can subscribe to us on SoundCloud and iTunes for free and get access to hundreds of author discussions, book analysis pieces, and more. Or, if your eyes need a workout, head to Booktopia TV on YouTube. Don't forget, for all books featured in this podcast and for access to a whole bunch of other fun content on our blog, head to Booktopia, Australia's local bookstore, at booktopia.com.au.